Samara Centre for Democracy's driving concern is how we make decisions together. This is what the work of democracy is all about. However, for democracy in Canada to be truly inclusive and responsive, the question of reconciliation is fundamental. Therefore, tonight, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat peoples, and that Toronto is still home to many Indigenous people, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and live on this land. Since Samara is concerned with political leadership, we particularly ask political leaders to meet the responsibilities to Indigenous communities. Please work across party lines to ensure that the needs and aspirations of Indigenous peoples are represented in our political life. Now, I would like to welcome our board chair, Michael McMillan, to the stage.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Elizabeth is our digital communications coordinator at Samara. My name is Michael McMillan. I'm the co-founder of Samara and the volunteer chair of the board. And on behalf of our board, and on behalf of Kendall Anderson, our executive director, and our staff, welcome, and thank you for coming this evening. And also a particular thank you to the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, the Honourable Lisa Raitt, who is here this evening. Thank you for coming, and thank you for being such a loyal and thoughtful supporter of Samara and our work. We appreciate it. So we're here this evening to launch our new book, Real House Lives. We're also here to conduct a panel discussion, really live exit interviews with three former parliamentarians, the Honourable Lisa Raitt, Peggy Nash, and Robert-Falcon Ouellette. So we'll get to that in due course, but first of all, before we get going, I just like to take about 3 steps back and sort of put this into context, at least as I see it. Thank you for coming this evening. COVID-19 is on all of our minds. We're not shaking hands, we're self-isolating, we're voluntarily or actually under fiat, in some cases, staying away from each other. It's a different kind of a life. It's a different kind of a world. It's a scary thing. And we're told that we are best off by ourselves and not with each other. And this virus reminds me a lot of another virus that's been going around the world in recent years, that virus that says that the other, that people who aren't like us or others who aren't like us but who are among us are to be avoided or feared. And that's a pretty scary trait, that idea, that retreating into the idea of acting and being alone. And in a way, it's sort of a metaphor, and it harkens my mind back to when Alison Lowe, who's here this evening, and I were starting Samara over a decade ago. We already then were concerned about seeing us all, as I said, bowling alone or acting alone. And we always had the view at Samara that government matters, and public leadership matters, and public service matters, and how we decide to live together matters, and how we decide to make decisions together matters. And if we get it right, it's great, and if we get it wrong, it's a really bad thing. And our view, even though Samara is a non-partisan charity, non-partisan in the sense that we are not affiliated, and we do not support any particular political party, we very much are of the view that we ought to make our decisions on how we live together. We ought to do that in public, and we ought to do it in purpose, as opposed to do it in private or by accident, or relying on noblesse oblige, or relying on the happenstance of the market to decide how we're going to choose how we treat each other. So this coronavirus, COVID-19 thing is a timely reminder of what we're trying to accomplish at Samara. We're trying to reconnect Canadians back into political life. We're trying to strengthen our sense of democracy and the effectiveness of our institutions here in Canada. One of the things that we did early on at Samara was an ongoing project of talking to former parliamentarians. And these exit interviews were first conducted almost 10 years ago. It led to a number of reports. It led to a book that Alison and I and our colleagues at Samara created called Tragedy in the Commons. And this was a group of 65 in that case, interviews with former parliamentarians. And we asked them what brought them to public life, what mattered, and what their advice to the nation would be after the fact. And it was quite remarkable how consistent and how unexpected their thoughts and their feedback and their challenges to us were. So we did that again with the cohort of former MPs who left office at the previous election, not last year, but 4.5 years ago. And we asked them again what brought them to public life, what did they want to accomplish, and what did they want all of us to hear. We thought that by speaking to former parliamentarians, they could speak with maybe a clarity of voice, certainly with an authority, and with less fear of reprisal from anybody else within their political roles. So that was the view. In this recent round of exit interviews, like the previous time, we went to their homes or their cafe or their local, not schoolyard, but somewhere in their natural habitat across the country, and spent an hour or two with each of them, asking them these questions. This has resulted in a series of essays that we published over the past year or so, and now in today's book that we're officially launching this afternoon, Real House Lives. So you'll hear Mike Morton interview our 3 former MP panelists. First of all, before we get to that, however, a couple of quick thank yous. First of all, Samara is a charity. We exist only by virtue of our begging bowl, which we pass around, and we get kind donations from individual Canadians, from foundations and from corporations. In exchange, we give them a tax receipt. So without those donations, we don't have anything. We are not supported by some magical government agency or body. We're funded entirely, or 99%, by individual or foundation donations. Thank you also to the Canadian Association of Former Parliamentarians, who put us in touch in the first place with the former MPs, and thank you specifically to Ian Waddell, a former MP and president of the CAFP Foundation. Of our sponsors, and our various sponsors, I should give a specific shout out to Bank of Montreal and the law firm Bennett Jones, who have both been loyal and significant funders of our work for a number of years. Thank you also to all the MPs who were interviewed for their time, for their candor, and for their thoughts. And thank you to all the Samara staff who organized this evening's event and for all the work that you do every day. We're recording this evening. It'll be up on our website in audio and video form, so even those who are still washing their hands at home will be able to watch this and listen to it and share in the interviews with our 3 former MPs. So again, thank you for coming. I'd now like to ask Mike Morton, who's our Director of Research at Samara, to come up and chat with the Honourable Lisa Raitt, with Peggy Nash, and with Robert-Falcon Ouellette. Thank you very much.
I'm glad I didn't wear my short skirt.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks for everyone who came out and joined us tonight despite this heightened sense of vulnerability I think that many of us are experiencing in ways we haven't in the past. We're very happy to be launching the Real Housewives book today, get it out in the world. It's a long process, as Michael set out, that involved traveling across the country, meeting former MPs, and interviewing them in ways that provided a unique kind of insight and access. And doing those interviews was both concerning and deeply edifying and encouraging. And the reason it was so edifying, in my view, is that it was a rare opportunity to really engage with former parliamentarians. The veil comes down, you get a chance to explore in depth and at length why they went into politics, what they sought to accomplish. And what you come away realizing is, in Canada, we have I believe, across party lines, a deep, profound culture of good governance, respect, and responsibility. And these are serious people, public-minded people, who, by and large, are in politics for the right reasons. And that might, in some circles, sound surprising, even dissonant. You're not supposed to talk about politicians in such glowing terms. But I thought, given the circumstances of the last days and weeks, we should start with the good news. We have that ethic of public leadership in Canada, and it's a lucky thing. And in times like this, it's a damn lucky thing. And if you want to see what the alternative looks like, you don't have to look far. I'm trying to point south, but I'm turning around. You know what I'm driving at. So that's the good news. And the bad news is there's lots, the book argues, that gets in the way of good people trying to do good work in public life. MPs describe being overwhelmed by work, not always the right work, by being policed by party leadership, even caucus, colleagues at times when they don't want to deal with the headaches and headlines that come with individuals thinking for themselves in public, and struggling to engage citizens despite a profound interest in hearing from citizens. So those are the obstacles that face us. And rather than going on at length about what's in the book, I would encourage you to buy it and explore it yourself. We want to turn it over to three people who have distinguished themselves in different ways and in different roles in public life, and do a kind of quasi-live exit interview in order that Samara can get out of the way and we can hear it from those who have that unique vantage point. So I want to introduce three individuals with very long biographies, which you can find on the reminder email we sent out. I'll introduce them very shortly. Peggy Nash is a former MP from Parkdale High Park. Robert-Falcon Ouellette, former MP from Winnipeg Centre. And Honourable Lisa Raitt, who's a former MP from Milton and Halton. And I think we should just get right into it. In the first book we wrote on the basis of the exit interviews called Tragedy in the Commons, we suggested that being an MP was a job without a job description. A lot of MPs describe this to us this round as well, a sense of being thrown into the deep end a little bit, trying to figure out where to apply your time and energy, despite coming from having accomplished so much in other fields. So I'm curious what your experience is and what surprised you the most when you got to Ottawa. Does anyone want to jump in first?
Well, I'll jump in.
Thanks.
I guess a contradiction maybe between being in this incredible place. I always and still do feel a sense of awe being in the Parliament buildings and feeling the history of the place and the transitoriness of being elected there. So I felt, when you stand and you speak in your place in the House, feeling just incredible pride and responsibility. And yet I was surprised when I found out that some of the roles were quite perfunctory. So, for example, in question period, you get 35 seconds to ask a question, 35 seconds to answer, and a lot of it's quite stage managed, and you can dig in to meatier speeches, but often you're speaking to an empty house. So I was surprised at how little debate there was actually in the House compared to committees, where you often are able to engage more directly, and I found that to be a much more satisfying experience. So the contrast between how great this place is and the wonderful feeling of finally getting there and then feeling that some of the time wasn't really well used and well served in terms of our democracy.
Is that a shared experience?
For me, I had a little bit of a different experience because I was plunked right into the executive position. I was in the executive branch, I guess. I was part of government as a cabinet minister. And I remember thinking, my gosh, boy, I'm being managed. And every minute of your day is consumed, and you are told by your deputy minister, here are the books to read, and you're told by your staff, here are the places you're going to go, and you're just told everything, what to do. And it lasted for every year of those 7 years that I sat in cabinet, that I had no ability to even color outside the lines a little bit, which is fine, because it probably protected democracy in general that I was kept to that restricted. Right, and that is a joke, by the way. However, being in opposition, it made me realize, number one, how much I didn't understand about Parliament, about the importance of it, about the value of being a member of Parliament. And I grew to have a lot more of a respect for the individuals that sat around me. And I reflected on this on International Women's Day on Friday, that of all the places I've ever worked in my life, I have found that the House of Commons was the most equal. Because as one of 338, you're one of 338, and you have all the same privileges and powers. And for me, that's maybe that has a little bit to say about the other places that I've worked in, but nonetheless, for me, it was looking back at my first experiences, knowing that I really did not get that crash course in democracy or what it meant. I was placed into a role in a position, and I wasn't a puppet. I performed and used my skills to help. However, I was programmed in terms of what I was supposed to do and when, and beyond the, got to go to question period and got to go to these meetings. It was just constant.
Can I just follow up really quickly? So you were a minister within, a month of going to Ottawa, or pretty much right away?
Yeah.
So when you found yourself in opposition, what were you learning about Parliament?
When I was in opposition?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, for example, I was never allowed to have a private member's bill. And I learned the importance of it, what a draw was, what it wasn't. I learned that, quite frankly, it is a grind to be a member of Parliament who wants to do good public policy work, because you don't have the staff that you may think you want to have. And if you do have staff, they may not be at the level you want them to be, especially if you've been around public policy for 20 years. Because the good people are often stolen by the other people, right? They come in at your level, and then they're often running somewhere else. They all want to work in the leader's office, regardless of opposition or in government. So those are the kinds of things I learned, and that you do have a lot more freedom as a member of Parliament than you do as a cabinet minister. And it is about how you use your time and what you do. But I also felt that I knew the ropes a little bit more. And I had wished, we had a big discussion, if you recall, Peggy, about democracy with Michael Chong's bill that made its way through Parliament. And there was so much discussion around it, and yet when we got to the point of implementing the bill that ended up passing, it was a bit of a fizzle.
It was puny.
Yeah,
it was puny.
It really was. Yet we fought so hard and had so much strong opinions on it. I don't know what else I can add to it in terms of what I noticed. I noticed a big difference, though.
Yeah, sure. No, that's really interesting. Robert-Falcon, your background was in military and academia. Did that prepare you? Did you feel for Parliament, or how different was it?
Well, nima komokantik tansei, nima tani atawa pamtikuk. I think the thing, when I arrived in Parliament, I was so aware that this, for me and my family and the people that I represent, and not only from Winnipeg Centre, but from the prairies, Indigenous peoples, First Nations, from my community. For instance, one of my ancestors, we had fought with Louis Riel in 1885 at Batoche. Near Battleford, we had 10 men who were hung in the largest mass hanging in Canadian history. And when Louis Riel, we knew his history, that he had been in Parliament. And for me, it was very significant to be able to be there. Just my presence. And I still get emotional thinking about that. The first time I got to go in the chamber. This is a place that, my ancestors would never have been allowed in. And so when I arrived, I really wanted to make sure that I make a difference. That my words weren't simply, because I heard so much about people reading talking points and reading prepared speeches and, just following along and going along with the crowd. And because every party prepares your position on a various issue and you can modify it a little bit. But what I wanted to do was I might only be there for 4 years. 1 term, maybe 2 if I'm lucky, and then because we have a huge turnover in the House of Commons, and I already knew that because I'm a university professor and I was studying this quite a bit. And I said, well, if I'm going to get up and give a speech, I'm going to make sure that this is from my heart. This is representing the people. And I was told by an elder, he said, your word is your honor, your word is the people. And I always took that in every moment I was in that house. And I loved every time I was in there. I know I've read the book, The Tragedy of the Commons, but I really believe, you can actually have debate in the House. It might not happen when people are watching. Because you have the speaking, the top people get the speaking points, at on a private member's bill or emergency debate, is some of the examples. We start off with the minister giving a speech on an emergency, perhaps on Indigenous suicide. I remember it was one of our first emergency debates in 2016. And then it goes over to the official opposition, the Conservatives, and I don't remember who did it on it was Cathy McLeod who spoke, and then it comes back to us or to the NDP, and then it goes around, and you're there till midnight, and you're like, okay, it's going to be my, and then you're arguing, and this is one of the things you have to kind of fight. Elbows up. Like, it's also kind of what I find as an anthropologist, I'm an anthropologist, is there are spheres of influence even within the party. And there are hierarchies about who gets to speak at what time. And so the parliament, you have the ministers who get, the chance to speak. Then you have parliamentary secretaries who have to give the official government position. And then whatever's left over for the backbench government MP is, usually, 10 minutes to midnight. And not 2 minutes, but 10 minutes to midnight. And so then you have your opportunity. But by that time, the media aren't listening, and so then you have to think, well, I'm speaking from the heart. I'm speaking for people who might not be in or who is going to have their voices heard. So how do I make sure that this, what I say, actually influences government policy? And I think that when I was, apart from a few other things, but I think that's what I was most surprised about was sometimes how difficult it was to find, ways of pulling levers to make a difference, to take, the ideas that you were sent there, your lived experience to, influence the government, not only from, in a public way, but also behind closed doors in the government lobby. And so that was perhaps most difficult. And I'll leave you with the other final thing that I was most surprised about is I had to become an administrator. What, I ran a department at the University of Manitoba with university programs and students and professors and things like that. But, to have to manage a budget and spend time, filing claims and making sure, everything is done, very properly according to the rules. Otherwise, we'll end up on the front page of some newspaper, that, someone did something. And there were all these rules, hundreds of rules in the House of Commons, and you kind of have to learn these rules over a certain period. And some days I think, is this why I was elected to be an administrator, or was I elected to represent the views of people in the House? I still wonder about that, but anyway.
But you ran for Speaker.
I did, but I wanted, once again, because I'll tell you why I ran for Speaker. It's, and I know it's kind of crazy, first time MP, but I said to myself, what, hey, this place is kind of stuck and ossified in the way it thinks. If I kind of throw in some different ideas, and I did get a lot of pushback, I got to admit. A lot of people were very, very, very upset. Some journalists were very upset. Oh, you're breaking the rules and the traditions of the House.
It's a place of a lot of traditions.
Lots of traditions.
I had you on my ballot.
Shoot! I should have kept going.
Not above the Conservative candidate, but you were there.
We served together on the finance
We did,
committee,
yeah.
and we thoroughly enjoyed each other's company.
Yeah, that's true.
So that's good. Robert-Falcon, you mentioned trying to figure out what levers to pull, and this is something we pursued with the MPs we interviewed. You know, how did you feel the most effective in Ottawa? And some talked about committee work, others talked about using private members' business. Sometimes it was pulling a minister aside in a back hallway, or sometimes it was getting out of the hill altogether and trying to build a movement. So this is something I wanted to ask you guys. Where did you feel like you were most effective at driving the kind of change that you were passionate about as MPs? Peggy, do you want to start?
Well, I'd say all of the above. I mean, if you don't organize in your community and try to bring the community to Ottawa, you don't really have that base. So for me, I had different communities. I had my constituency, and there were issues that I would take to Ottawa, whether we had a big Tibetan community, so that was an issue, or rail safety was an issue. So these were things that we would organize in the community and then push for them in Ottawa. But often, and Lisa knows this, you walk across the floor to speak to a minister to try to get things done on behalf of your constituents. Usually, sometimes it was immigration issues or I don't know what, EI, something where you really needed to get the minister's attention. I think I never had a great luck of the draw when it came to private members' bills. I had lots of private members' bills, but they never made it to the floor. But I think it differs whether you're in government and if you're a minister or where you sit. I was in 2 parliaments, and in one I was part of a fairly small caucus, and we were the 4th party. So history's kind of repeating itself now. But then I was in a caucus that was the official opposition, but it was a majority government. So it was much more difficult to actually get things done, except for speaking with a minister. Sometimes you could influence things at committee, but ultimately the government had a majority. So what I tried to do as the finance critic was, I had my key issues like infrastructure spending, and we would really try to make that a priority, and I could get the others in my caucus to raise that issue, and we would push on it. In a minority government, I mean, I remember when Jim Prentice was chair of the industry committee, and it was a minority conservative government, and the government was going to sell a space company, McDonnell Detweiler. And anyway, we raised a hell of a hullabaloo on that, and got witnesses to, I was one person on the committee, got witnesses to the committee, made the case, and Jim Prentice ultimately made the decision to stop the sale of that company.
Yep.
And it was the first time that had happened. It was the first sale that was blocked. That was something I felt, okay, it kept an important Canadian company in Canada. It's now Canadian, owned by Jim Balsillie and some others. And I felt, okay, that got accomplished, even though I was part of a 19-member caucus. So you never know. There's, as you say, Robert, you got to look for your opening. You got to know where to shoot the puck if you want to coin a phrase.
I would say that obviously, as a minister, you get more done, but not necessarily what's in your mandate letter. And in my last portfolio was transport, where I had lots of experience, and I was able to figure out how to push through something that was an incredible annoyance for many people, but it needed a legislative fix, and that was whether or not you're allowed to hold your phone as you took off or landed on an airplane in Canada. And I look at that as possibly one of my biggest accomplishments, because it took about 9 months of trying to figure out which lever to pull.
Was that you that did that? Thank you so
Yes,
much.
it was me, Peggy Nash.
Yeah, a round of applause.
See what I mean? Yeah, lots of things I did. But that, to me, it's working, it's knowing your portfolio enough to know what was really important to stakeholders out there and what was a real annoyance, and try to fix something in the government. And Peggy and I were talking about this earlier. Bureaucracy is big. 285,000 people work in this Government of Canada piece, and they don't always get it right. In fact, they get it wrong an awful lot. And even I was sharing how when I separated from the House of Commons, every aspect of my separation, the bureaucrats got wrong. They sent a check to a non-existent account at a different bank that I didn't bank at. They gave me dental benefits, then took them away. They insured me, and then they didn't insure me. And it all means that I have to go through this process. And I thought, I think I better contact my MP to get some help on this. He may not be helpful. But it does show you that it can be frustrating. Even when you know what the system is, you still sometimes need a little bit of help interpreting. And that's why, in your book, you talked about whether or not we become paper pushers and whether or not we're taking on roles that the public service really should be fulfilling. My gosh, if we don't do that, there would be a lot of families that do not have their kids with them. There'll be people who wouldn't be getting their Canada pension. There'll be people who wouldn't be getting their EI. There'll be people with massive mistakes on CRA because, as you know, CRA still can't give the right information on their hotline. And that is the role of the Member of Parliament that I was really invested in. And what I did was I just made sure I had really good people that worked for me in my office. And those caseworkers are worth their weight in gold. And by the way, after 11 years, they were burnt out. Like Alexandra is still not returned to the workforce yet just because it was a long 11 years. So she deserves her time off. And she'll find something else, but maybe not dealing with the public again.
The question was how you felt most effective in the comments. So you talked about trying to make change through giving a powerful speech instead of.
Well, I also think one of the things, MPs, the executive side, it's kind of interesting. I think there is a difference between when you are in opposition versus when you are in government. It is extremely important because, when you're in government and, you need to work on an issue or you have an idea, you can see the government ministers, the executive branch on a daily basis, and you can say hello, you can talk about those issues, you can influence them. I'm not the one directing anything as a backbench MP. Simply I think the role of an MP is to be an influencer. Opposition, I think they have question period, they have other moments which are very often very vocal and very important. But what I found is a lot of work actually does get done behind the closed doors, and some days it might be at over drinks, it might be at dinner, it might be at a quick little lunch or just a cup of tea, having a chat and having a sometimes a laugh with, or even sometimes the ministers come to your riding. Diane Laboutier, who's the Minister of National Revenue, came to Winnipeg a number of times, and her English has improved considerably. She's from Quebec, from the Gaspé. But, as I speak French as well, I had the opportunity of spending, a couple days with her on extended periods, traveling around the region. And, so I could push ideas saying, well, we got this new Canada Child Benefit for people. How are you going to ensure that Indigenous families also get this benefit to lift them out of poverty? They have to file taxes. Okay, so is there a unit for them to go out and file taxes, or goes out to specifically advocate to Indigenous communities they should file their taxes? Because there's a whole slew of history related to taxation on reserve communities, whether people have a job to even pay taxes, so why even file taxes? But if you don't file taxes, even if you have no money to pay to the government, you will not get the Canada Child Benefit, which is significant, has helped reduce poverty among children, which is extremely important. One of the reasons, why I was in Parliament.
Did you feel that other backbenchers in the governing party understood that role and were effective in influencing ministers? We had one MP suggest to us that they felt like the the nature of that role isn't always properly understood, and that you're not a part, you don't belong to the executive, but you're there to sort of work your influence in other ways.
Well, I think MPs have different reasons why they're there, different focuses. The goal is, I focus on my riding, I want to get reelected. Others, I'm in Ottawa, while I'm here, I'm going to work really hard, and, that's a good thing, and everyone has a different level or level of influence. Like, there are some issues that no one really seems to care too much about if I talk about it. Like, people don't, I had a couple of times I wanted to talk a little bit about international or foreign affairs. People really wanted me to talk about Indigenous issues. I remember being on the Finance Committee with Lisa, and people really, okay, Robert, you're here on the Finance Committee, but, you should talk about some Indigenous issues. So I ended up talking or asking all the questions about Indigenous things. Once in a while, other MPs on the committee would ask those questions of the minister, but generally it was always me asking those questions. If I asked about bond trading and other things, they might not, they might not care about it, or it's just that, I'm not seen as being an expert in that field, perhaps, or not being credible. It's not my expertise. While other MPs might have a much deeper understanding. I know that you worked in the financial sector, and you probably have you were great on the Finance Committee. A couple of times I had my jaw dropped, like, wow, what a question. I wish I'd come up with that idea.
But isn't that the great thing about the House of Commons, is that we're really mostly generalists. We're all generalists. Whatever your, whether you were a medical doctor, a lawyer, or an economist, or my friend Tracy Ramsey, who came off the Ford Assembly line, whatever your background is, and that's the House of Commons. I love that about it, that people come from all these backgrounds. And there's some people who have that, we were just talking about, she ran for leader, Kelly Leach. She was the Labour Minister. So even if you have an area of expertise, that may not be your portfolio or the committee that you sit on. And I really like that, because I think, yes, you do have to learn things. You learn a lot. But it plays to people's common sense and sense of their community. I don't know. I like the fact that we're generalists.
And on that point, on backbenchers, the most, look, as a minister, to your point about people coming and asking you for stuff, for sure there were people who were far better at getting a minister's ear and trying to get their own project advanced. But I found those were people who had backgrounds in organizing, or people who had backgrounds in being in provincial politics, or maybe in a councillor kind of thing, or in a university where they were used to that kind of advocacy. I mean, 4 years in a majority government goes by like that, and if you're in a minority, it's, 18 months to get anything done, really. And as a result, the people with experience in advocating for the community are head and shoulders above those who are just coming in as just being elected. And it does, to the victor go the spoils. And they knew, I did a lot of work for the Atlantic provinces, I tell you. They had some guy, Greg Kerr was former Minister of Finance from Nova Scotia, and he knew exactly what to say and tell me where to go and find it in the budget and make sure I delivered it to his riding. And he was successful. And now there's a ferry to Yarmouth. So,
one of the interesting things about the Atlantic Caucus that we even in the Liberal from 2015 to 2019 is actually, it's interesting you mentioned, but they were actually very coordinated even within our caucus in trying to advance their collective interests within the larger government. And they would, coordinate amongst themselves. Oh, well, I'll tell Lisa today something, and then the next day another MP will say the similar thing in the minister's ear, and then the next day another MP. And
caucuses within caucuses.
Caucuses
Very
within
much.
caucuses,
Very
influencing what the decisions are being made. It's quite fascinating to watch how people sometimes because it's not, it's sometimes really not even organized. It's just kind of people kind of figuring it out themselves, with some people who kind of say, oh, if you do this and you do this and I'll do this for you, and maybe it'll get something done.
That's fascinating. So we're hearing about sort of various tools in the tool belt, and different MPs sort of figuring out different ways to wield those, different levels of effectiveness. So those are the levers available to you. what were the biggest obstacles to what you felt your job was or what you were trying to accomplish in Ottawa?
Not being in power.
That's good.
Not having enough money.
Not having enough.
There's never enough money. There's not enough money in the universe to do everything that everybody wants to do in Parliament.
But I'd like to be there to try.
I'm not surprised, Peggy Nash. But yeah, there's just not enough money. And I think the biggest challenge that I found in getting things done, I'm going to be honest with you, is sometimes perhaps the public service was a little bit more no than they were. I don't mean Bill more no, but they're a little bit more about saying no than they were about saying yes. And there's a great ability for process to impede progress. And that is true both in terms of sitting in the government or sitting in the House of Commons. Filibusters, your debate not coming back for months because somebody's decided your PMB is not going to make it through on this go-around. So those are the challenges, is that, again, the timing is held by other people, either within the bureaucracy, within the government, within the House. And that's just something you don't have any control over whatsoever.
Any other thoughts on obstacles? Yeah.
Well, I felt that in a minority government, you needed to cooperate to get things done. And so sometimes it was the opposition ganging up against the government. Sometimes you could ally with the government to get something done. And so I'm a big fan of proportional representation for that reason, because I find, I know it probably goes fast when you're in government, not having experienced that, but it does create a system where the government's agenda, yes, it can be delayed by procedure, by rules, but basically the government is in the driver's seat, and they won the most seats, they should be, but not to the total exclusion of the opposition. And so I believe that if it wasn't a winner-take-all system, that we would be forced to forge alliances and engage in more cooperation.
So,
well, I think for myself, the most difficult issues were really related to the procedure. Whether, as examples, a lot of Indigenous issues. We had a bill or an issue related to Indian status that's been going on for decades. Who's an Indian, who's not an Indian, women with status, whether they, it was changed back in 1985 by a conservative government. And then they only gave status to a certain generations, and then they excluded other generations, being discriminatory still against women and their descendants. And a bill came forward, and the government wanted to modify it, or the government lawyers wanted to modify it just enough to meet the ruling of the court. But, the judge said, well, you probably should go further than what I've suggested here as the minimum, in order to eliminate all discrimination. And it took a long time. It took, they presented one bill, I was arguing about it, it was voted on by the House. I was very upset over it. It went to the Senate. The Senate, I work with the senators. There are other spheres of influence in Parliament as well. You don't have to accept simply what happens in the House as being the final say, and you work with senators. They change the bill. It comes back to the House after 6 months, and then you can get that change that I was looking for. But the bureaucracy does spend a lot of time, I feel, because they've been doing things for so long. And I talk about reconciliation as an example. It's very hard to take 281,000 individuals who have been doing something for 152 years and saying, today we're going to do things a little bit differently. It's because people have invested, their efforts, their energies into doing something in a certain way. And when you tell them, well, that was right, but now we want to change. Whoa. what's the basis? Where is this change coming from? What's the procedure? What's the precedent? What's the outcomes that are going to come of this? What will be what will be the impacts of this decision? And there's lots of little things that need to be done before something can be agreed to. And people can find lots of ways of putting up roadblocks in order to say no to an idea or an issue. And it just makes you have to work so much harder to get to something that you're going to do in the end. But, why don't we just do it? So we can focus on other things, because there are so many things in Canada that, we could change and need changing, and people that need to be included or in the political system, but because we have all these procedures, we just create such barriers to advancing in a more timely way.
No, it's good. We tend to think about, Samara tends to think about power within Parliament, but it's good to be reminded that you're also trying to grab the steering wheel of this enormous ship, and it might be hard to turn even when it seems like you're in the driver's seat. I wanted to pick Peggy up on this question of cooperation, because one of the things that I found really fascinating in the interviews was how often MPs described a kind of almost unrequited desire for stronger, deeper relationships with members from other parties. I found that really striking, even the way MPs recalled, small acts of cooperation or even just small acts of kindness. And so I'm curious, what your experiences were building relationships across party lines, and if you were able to do so effectively, why you think it worked, despite a context which is in some respects, maybe more polarized than the Commons once was.
Well, Lisa and I were talking earlier about partisanship, and anybody who has won a seat in a swing riding, and Lisa, well, I guess all of us, that's all of us, you have to work so hard to get elected. And then when you're elected, you have to keep working hard, not just to do your job as an MP, but to keep trying to win support. A friend once described it as though you're running at 100 kilometers an hour and there's somebody running after you with an axe at your back. You feel constantly that pressure of that partisan competition. So anybody who goes through that kind of an election feels that. However, there do exist all kinds of opportunities. We talked about going across the floor, talking to ministers, talking to other members, trying to build support. We would work together on various committees. I was very lucky to work on committees where, I'm just trying to think, well, probably the best committee was the Finance Committee with James Rajat as the chair. And I think he genuinely tried to be fair to all parties. He tried to be collegial. He would try to engage us after hours to build relationships. And the last parliament that I was in, and that was the Conservative majority, under Stephen Harper, there were, certainly a lot of complaints, and we complained as loud as anybody about partisanship in the government and not answering questions in question period and omnibus budget bills, all of these things. And I don't know the internal machinations of the Conservative caucus at that time, but I do have to say, when I went across the floor and spoke with ministers or engaged people in discussions, people were very collegial. And what stands out in my mind was the press gallery dinner, Lisa, where Elizabeth May was at the mic and she was having a really rough time.
I thought, Peggy, you were going to talk about the fact that we always dance together at the press gallery, which is true too.
But she was having a difficult time at the mic. People were getting really uncomfortable. And Lisa, who by this time had kicked off her uncomfortable shoes and was in her stocking feet, raced to the front of the room and just put an arm around Elizabeth, and everybody just went, okay, she's got it under control. And it was really an act of kindness and empathy. And I don't know, I didn't travel much because was in a very competitive riding, but the couple of trips I did take, one was to observe an election that was multi-party, and another time for religious event that was important to my community. And, people that I probably had very little in common with, getting to know them, traveling with them, having a meal with them, it just made a huge difference. So I wish there were more opportunities to do that, even coinciding with the kind of dog-eat-dog politics of getting elected, staying elected.
So I've learned two things now that I'm in private sector. And they're a little bit difficult for me to learn, I have to admit. The first is, after years and years and years of being told not to spend any money on entertainment, and if you do, we're going to publicize it to all of Canada, it would appear my job is to actually take people to lunch. And I have PTSD every time someone says, do you want to go out to lunch? Because I've spent 11 years not doing that.
Front page of the Globe, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's one lesson. The other lesson I learned is a piece of advice I was given by a friend of mine, Mark Spiro, who made the very astute observation that in government, in partisanship, the people across the aisle are your enemy. And they're not on your side. And in the private sector, just because someone disagrees with you doesn't mean that they're not on your side, because you're on the same team and you're going to work together on certain things. I have a hard time at the bank now trying to remember that when somebody disagrees with me, it's not all, that's it. I'm never talking to them again. They're not on my side. They're going to be the official opposition of my entire time at CIBC. And that's the way it's going to go. And I have to step back and realize that not everybody thinks along partisan lines all the time. And it's really hard to unwind that and remind myself a lot that it's not the case. But why is it okay that we're like that in Parliament, and why are we trained to be that way? Because, I didn't come upon this naturally. This is something that has been embedded in me in the last 11 years, to the point where somebody outside the process can actually make the observation and give the warning that as you re-enter, remember, not everybody is going to try to be your enemy. In fact, everybody is your friend. And that's why sometimes I think the private sector look at us and say, you're a bunch of lunatics, because we have to get along with everybody. We're all on the same team. Are we not on all the same team Canada? That adage, we're all on the same team, trying to do what's better for our country. Why do we then line up as bitter enemies?
And just one thing that I think I did learn in my time being elected is that the vast majority of MPs, whatever political stripe they are, people get elected because they want to make the country a better place. There's the odd person who says, well, I just really want to be somebody. But most people really want to make the country a better place. They come because they believe they can make a difference. And they may be totally diametrically opposed paths, but there was a genuineness that I found in most members of Parliament.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. People are very, very nice in the House generally. There are some people that I think are a little scary.
I want to know who now.
No, I'm not going to say who.
Come on. Okay.
But there are some individuals that I'd be a little reticent to maybe cross the floor to shake hands with. Others, I've been to music concerts with. We've hung out, both Conservatives and NDP. I've chatted with Elizabeth May, the Bloc Québécois. I was on, we were on visiting a military installation once because I was in the military for a number of years, and had a great conversation with them. Got to go. We were on a submarine actually. Yeah, it was pretty cool. Yes, but you had to. It was the opportunity of actually building relationships. And one of the things actually I really loved is I actually kind of enjoyed the partisanship. I didn't like it when it got too hyper and too excited. But and I think there's a kind of a moderate level of partisanship, which I think is actually good. It coalesces groups around an idea about what our society and the direction our society should go in. And, it offers, something very distinctive to Canadians, because if we're all some just bland form of Canadian values, I think we're all Canadian values up here. I think it makes it hard for Canadians to choose, well, are we choosing over personality, over ideas? What do we want in a government? And I think Canadian government works really best when it's surrounding ideas and how they juxtapose themselves in the larger international sphere, the United States, England, in China, all these other countries, and how we fit in together. And the partisanship, though, I like, for instance, I remember the Conservatives forced us to do those late night votes, for 48 hours in a row or something like that. And I loved it. You're in a historic moment. We're holding up the government. We're fighting for what we believe in. We're funding this organization. We're funding this organization. And, it's exciting, but it's long. Every 12 minutes you get to stand up. And your vote's recorded, and everyone's kind of griping because we're all tired, and it's kind of it's fun, and I know, but there is kind of one thing that I do realize, as well as some of my my colleagues. Like, one of the colleagues was sitting next to me. He was in his late 60s. He was a little tired with the late night votes. He found it very strenuous, but I was just in my early 40s. And I was like, "Well, this is awesome! Like, we can go all night. Let's do this for 3 more days." No, Robert, don't say that. Don't yell at them across the way. We can get an agreement and go home.
Well, we learned that from, Peggy, when you guys came in as opposition, we started off in 2011.
Did that to the Conservatives,
yeah. Yeah, you did that to us. It was 3 days, the end of June at the very, very end.
It was brutal. It was brutal.
Overnight, yeah.
Yeah, but I found it was camaraderie, because our House leader, Pablo, got up and gave a rousing speech before we go in to start this vote. And, everyone's cheering and we're all pumped up and we're excited.
During our votes, I remember we would share snacks in the House of Commons. We'd throw, Smarties and stuff. It kind of degenerated.
It got to be. We did it 3 times. We did it. You guys forced it once in 11, and then Liz May had us do the one on the budget on the navigable waters change, and then we did it to you guys. So welcome to the club, buddy.
Love it.
It's all good.
Yeah, let's do it again. We'll do it again tonight.
No, but you guys brought all your cots. Well, the funny story about that is you guys brought your cots in. So the government of Canada, in the last time, they brought in cots and they set them all up. I know they
in the lobby?
In the lobby, in the new parliament, they leased or they purchased or rented all these cots for their MPs to go and lie down. So one of our guys decided...
That's a soft way.
I know, totally. But one of our guys decided to borrow one of the cots and brought it back, and everybody took their picture with the cot and sent it over to the Liberals. So,
well,
it's all high school, right, guys? It's all high school.
No, but you do get some little hour off because you do kind of rotate. There is kind of a ladies and gentlemen's agreement about how the voting goes, because otherwise it is unmanageable. You do need at least an hour of sleep once in a while. And
we never did that. We never got the hour.
Oh well, it should be. It should be nicer than that, less partisan. But we had. I remember Catherine McKenna, our Minister of the Environment. She had set up her pillow and her sleeping bag on one of the couches, and I guess she set it up, and I came out, and it was empty, and I was like, slipped right in, put something over my face, and I was out, and she came out afterwards, and she's like, "Oh, Robert's asleep. I'll go somewhere else."
You're Goldilocks.
Yeah, she did. Yeah, she did not. She left me alone, suit and tie, but she was more relaxed because you still have to wear suit and ties. You can't escape it.
Yeah, we heard this in the interview of the all-night voting. Someone said it was great. It was like summer camp, and I made such good friends, and I didn't expect that. So just want to leave a few minutes for question and answer at the end. So why don't we just zoom out, and I'll ask simply because some people here might be contemplating pursuing public office, knowing what you know now. At the end of it all, maybe not the end, at this juncture. Would you do it again? Would you do it the same way? Would you do it differently?
Well, I have no plans to run again, but I'm still super enthused about politics. When I came here, I came from a class that I teach at Ryerson on women in politics. We do a Women in the House program. And these young women are just so enthusiastic and excited about politics. So I still feel that way. I do some international work on that as well. What I would have liked to have known, I guess from the first time I was elected, where we were just kind of thrown in on our own, our party, our caucus was so small, we didn't really know what we were doing. I would have liked more of that savvy guidance of the people who know how to get things done, that kind of informal thing. But I still have the political bug. I would encourage anybody who's thinking of it to talk to me. I would love to share my enthusiasm. And, is it worthwhile? I felt, in spite of all the limitations and never actually making it to government, I would say best job ever, such a privilege. So I would recommend it to anybody.
I would recommend it to everyone. I think it's one of the most noble things you can do for your country, for your community, for your family. It's absolutely, I loved every minute of it. Even the very difficult moments when I was, there was moments when you were angry, you were upset about, the way a decision had gone. But, if you're patient and you're persistent and you push and, in a gentle way sometimes, you don't even have to be angry about it. You just kind of take a deep breath. You can get the end result that you're looking for. And you have to realize you're also part of 338 other people, and then at least another 1,000 people who work as political staffers on the Hill, and then there's deputy ministers. It is an absolutely beautiful experience, and I think we should actually have more respect for politicians, because also it is people, if they do go into it, they should realize it is actually quite a large sacrifice. Like essentially my university career. If I go back in, I might run again, I might not, but I have to make a decision about, funding on research grants that I had. I had, almost $750,000 worth of research grants that I had to give up when I became elected, ending, a fairly, which I thought would have been in today's climate, a faster rise through academia. And so that is that's a career path that you either close at some point and you have to pick something. And, as my grandmother said, this is a risky proposition that you've chosen.
So I'm still detoxing from the election, and I'm trying to get my head around the last 11 years, but I have two thoughts coming out of my time. And I've stopped referring to it almost as if it's a prison sentence, I did my time kind of thing. But I had two thoughts. Number one, if you're a young person and you think that you may want to go into politics, I highly recommend you doing almost like a gap year and going to work for a politician on the Hill, Queen's Park, City Council, wherever. Go and do that, because I think that will give you a good basis on how the process works. And it's very important to know what the process is in order to be effective as a member of parliament or an MPP. Because you don't want to waste your time being there. Peggy's right. We always said there's two types of people: those who go to Ottawa to be someone, and those who go to Ottawa to do something. So you want to go to Ottawa to do something, learn the ropes, do a gap year, don't jump right into running necessarily if you have the luxury of time on your hands. And the second thing is at the other end of the spectrum, which is I am not a big fan of people going longer than 3 terms. I'm going to tell you, I was exhausted at the end of my 3rd term. I don't know. I still represent at Milton, but I got to tell you, it's a long haul. And if you're doing it right, you should be exhausted by the time you get to the end of it all. So always think about what your exit looks like, and that you are going to eventually, you have a finite amount of time to get something done. Pick when it makes the most sense for you in your life to do it, but try to garner a little bit of experience beforehand, so when you have that golden opportunity to run and win, you're going to get something done, and you look back on it with great fondness.
Thanks so much. So we do have about 10 minutes for questions. There are microphone stands on both sides. it would be great. I would encourage you to ask quick questions, get to the question mark part as quickly as possible in order that we can collect as many questions in these 10 minutes as possible. Wonderful. Do you want to start on this side? Thank you.
Sure. Hello. My name is Shireen Salti. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Arab Institute. Before that, I was actually an intern at the Ontario Legislature Internship Program, sponsored by Samara Canada, and I've worked for both government and opposition members of MPPs, which was the most fascinating job I've ever had. So thank you all for sharing your insights and for being here. It's really admirable listening to all of you. I've always been interested in the diversity of members of parliament in the House and how it reflects sort of our society's demographics. And so, Lisa, I know you spoke a little bit about how, the House being such an equal place for you as a member of parliament. I'm curious to know what you think are some steps each party can take to ensure that it is more equal, not only inside, but at an equal place to get to through the nomination process, et cetera, to ensure it reflects the diversity of our country. Thank you.
That's a different question. Are we listening to everybody and then talking? I'm sorry, I wasn't listening.
You can answer. Do you want to jump right in?
Well, but that's the key, right? Once you get there, you're all equal. Getting there is the hard part. And we need to do a lot better. And that's a whole different conversation about how we ensure NDP and Liberals have different ways to approach it than we do. In my party, I can speak on behalf. We were much better in getting more women to run last time than the times before, of which I'm very proud. But the struggle continues. I'm going to continue on the path of making sure that we attract women and diverse people to the party without a question. Beg, borrow, and steal wherever I can.
Well, I never would have been able to run for the nomination if our party didn't have an equity provision. So before a constituency can have the party nomination, you have to have equity candidates. So when I first ran, I didn't do what Lisa suggested, which is being an intern and finding out how things worked. I did just jump in. And I just jumped in to run for the candidacy. But I found out there was a guy who'd been campaigning for about 6 months to win the nomination. And if there hadn't been the rule that they needed an equity candidate, they couldn't have had, that's why they hadn't held the nomination. So because of that rule, which I didn't even know about, I was able to run, mount a campaign, and win the nomination. And it has, because I've also done candidate search, it has helped us in finding more diversity in our candidates, and I think we've been doing a much better job. What we haven't been doing a better job of is actually winning the seats. And that's not because of diversity, it's just other political factors. But I think if we had the right political muscle and we were able to win, we would be electing a much more diverse group of representatives.
I know you're approaching it, from multiple perspectives, but I think there's actually another one, is social class. I think the House of Commons is actually fairly uniform in its social class. I know there are people that have been refugees previous to this, Hamid Hussein, and people that, did grow up relatively poor, but generally people are fairly middle class. If you ask MPs how many have tattoos, not very many people have tattoos. If you ask regular Canadians, or even for instance in Winnipeg, most Winnipeggers, I generally find many of them will have tattoos. And it's kind of interesting, because I think this, that idea of like where you're from and that social class actually does predetermine a lot of the policies that you're going to favor. And there are issues with government. Sometimes they tweak a tax measure or something like that. British Columbia just had this recently in their budget. They tweaked a child benefit, and they tweak something in the tax code, And, it actually was more detrimental to the people who were in greater poverty than people who were in the more upper middle class. But the people who are in parliaments or who are in politics are generally the middle, upper class. The upper classes generally stay out most times. It's fairly unusual to have someone from the upper classes who participates, like Bill Morneau. It's an unusual thing because they have other levers they can do to influence society. That's probably more fun. But I think for average Canadians, I think we have to find ways of getting those other peoples involved in politics, but that I don't know how to do it, because I think, apart from mandating, quotas, how do you decide, one riding versus another riding? It's so difficult. Even, how many women we have in the House, how many visible minorities, do we have enough people who were born outside of the country, people who are LGBTQ, Indigenous Canadians, racialized minorities, the list can go on and it becomes very, very difficult. It's interesting to hear some parties do have mechanisms, but I'm not, some days it's just, you got to get in there if you have a dream and just duke it out and fight for what you want, and never say never that it might not happen. People gave me the the least unwinnable riding in Winnipeg Centre. They said, "Oh, you'll never win it, but you can run, Robert." And I was asked to run, and lo and behold, in 2015 I won. So the team won, the people as well.
So I'll suggest maybe collecting a question on both sides. Yeah. So, sir, thank you.
So this terrific session, thank you all for being here. I'm huge fans of each of you and a big fan of the Samara Centre for Democracy and putting together forums like this. And you may have already covered this to a degree, but I followed each of your careers with interest even before you each ran. And I'm wondering, sometimes people feel that when someone gets elected, they park their brain at the door of the House of Commons. And yet there has been great successes. And I'm sure each of you left Parliament feeling you did have some successes. I remember when Lisa ran and she wasn't on a panel, a post-panel of leadership candidates. And I said, why wasn't Lisa there? I'd be a Liberal, but I said Lisa was who should have been up there, and next thing you know, she's deputy leader. And I think you accomplished, each of you, some great things. I'm wondering if you could share with us what you feel the best thing you did. Obviously it affected people's lives in your own riding, but that affected all Canadians that we could take away, because I don't think we do enough in celebrating success in political life. Canadians tend to see all the rhetoric and the negativity, and I think it's a great opportunity with all of you up there to maybe celebrate something you each did, and maybe we could each leave with that knowledge today would be helpful.
That's great. I think that's a really great question. I'll just grab one more and then turn it over.
Great, thank you very much. My name is Kent Glowinski, and I actually work for the public sector. And the question I had, because I work in the privacy area before the federal government, now provincial government, is when we're looking at social media and the fact that I'm 41 years old and we look at younger generations, no one's perfect. They've done things maybe that weren't awesome, that weren't acceptable at one point, which are on Facebook, which are out there now, but then they get vetted by a party. And all of a sudden, someone who's a great person, who's had one or two things happen in the past that wasn't great. What kind of advice do you give to someone like that who says, I want to run, but I haven't lived that perfect life because of social media?
Great. So, favorite accomplishment and,
Well, I'll start with the second question first. We can all remember in election campaigns gotcha moments where someone had this tweet or a post on Facebook. There's a whole generation that's growing up now that's going to leave this. Their social media profiles will be littered with this stuff, and I wonder whether it will just become less of a deal breaker for politicians in the future. Because yes, we've all said and done dumb things, but some of us were lucky enough not to have a video of it or a post on Instagram or whatever. And so I guess it always depends on the degree of the comment, but I do know some examples of people in the last, I think it was provincial campaign, who there was an NDP candidate who had made some comment about the police or something, and basically he kind of blew past it. It didn't affect him ultimately. So I think it depends on degree, but I think there's going to be greater acceptance of people's fallibility. I hope there is. In terms of accomplishments or things, you know, Lisa and I were talking before the panel that some of the most satisfying work you do as an MP is representing your constituents. You know, I used to do these disability tax clinics. So people didn't know they could qualify for a tax credit. And I remember one woman, we got her $30,000 because she could go back several years. And that was huge. You know, there was a fellow who had a relative in a human rights. I believe he was Eritrean. He was blind, and he had a relative in a refugee camp. And he contacted me from Kitchener, where he had moved, a couple of years after I was defeated, to tell me that this relative had finally made it to Canada, and thank you so much for all the work our office had done. So you need amazing staff, but boy, you can make a real concrete difference in people's lives.
I agree completely. I think there are some beautiful things that are done with your staff members. I think my staff did some incredible work, people who had been ignored for a long time. Because I think some people, you know, I think it's interesting when you have a swing seat or it becomes a swing seat, people can't take it for granted. You know, the person who was in my riding before, you know, was been there for a very long time. And there were a lot of cases that I spent a lot of time cleaning up that had been on the books for 7 years, veterans issues. And, you know, it took a long time because the cases were very complicated, but, you know, someone's life you made a difference in, like, and, you know, that's gratifying. But also I'd like to say, like, on the parliamentary side, when being in the House, you know, all the work actually that you do is not by yourself either. It's, you know, it's actually a team of people influencing with you, ministers, you know, making decisions, you know, deputy ministers, political staff that you work with, some lobbyists sometimes working, Indigenous organizations or other organizations, trying to get things done. And, you know, for me, like, some of the things I'm most proud of is the Canada Child Benefit, ensuring that we have a homeless plan, that we have a housing budget to get people, you know, off the streets. We have a meth and, you know, an opioid crisis strategy, and, you know, we're trying to develop that. You know, the child welfare legislation for Indigenous peoples, the Indigenous language legislation, you know, that I was intimately involved in, getting translation of Indigenous languages in the House, like those things, you know, and I look back and I say, 4 years, you know, I can look myself in the eye in the mirror in the bathroom before I go to bed at night and say, yeah, you know, bravo Zulu.
Starting on the social media, it's almost like a lesson in crisis communications now, and the path is very clear. You have to own it, you don't deny it. You apologize, you're authentic when you apologize, and show that you've learned from it and move on. And that's the best thing that you can do, and that's kind of what I tell my kids all the time, that that's their path forward for the obvious mistakes that they're going to be making in their young lives, being that they're 18 and 15 young men. And on the accomplishments, one thing that I do think that I've made a difference in is I've been really lucky in mentoring some great kids. You know, I was there for 11 years, and there's some people out there. A woman who came to work for me in my constituency office, she had a BA in history. She was working in a warehouse doing stock checking. She came to work with me in my constituency office, and now she's got a fantastic condo and a wonderful job with a corporate business in downtown Toronto because she trained with me for 5 years and understood how to do stakeholder relations and never would have got that training anywhere else. So that's why I'm saying do a gap year, go get some experience. It really does. It does help. And the other thing I will tell you that I did do, and I'm proud of it, that I did it at the time, and you're probably not going to believe I did it at the time because I'm a conservative, but I had a rule when I was Minister of Labour and Minister of Transport I had a number of boards I had to appoint, and I had a number of entities that I'd have to deal with. And a rule was, if you didn't have a woman on your board, I wasn't going to take your meeting. You could go talk to somebody else in my office, but you weren't going to talk to me. Which was shocking at the time, because this was like 7-8 years ago. But I also made sure that I was finding good women in smaller communities and putting them on boards of airport authorities and port authorities where they could get their experience. And one thing I want to leave you with, that, and this is one of the issues that I find for a lot of us, in a lot of women, a lot of racialized Canadians, is people think that experience in the subject matter matters the most. I'm going to tell you, it's talent that matters. You look for talent. You don't look for experience in the subject matter, and that will help us move along the curve a little bit more. So I had a little tiny piece with it. Look, Liberals in the NDP have been doing this longer than I had, and I'm totally impressed with what they've accomplished as well. But we're not agnostic on this either. We're all part of it. Oh, I was going to say, just to make Peggy laugh, I was going to say community mailboxes. Anyone?
So we wanted to draw things to a close. So the suggestion is just to very, very, very quickly collect the last 4 questions, and the panelists can feel free to answer 1 or 2. 4 is a lot to hold in your head. So over here first, thanks.
Thanks so much for coming. My name's Kevin, and Lisa, earlier you mentioned Michael Chong's reform bill, which passed but hasn't had the desired impact. And I think even Michael is not particularly happy with the outcome so far. In fact, he's somewhat been radicalized by it. For anybody who's been paying attention to Michael Chong recently, he's been promoting the idea of essentially turning political parties into public institutions as opposed to like private clubs, which is pretty radical considering our past. Anyway, my question for the three of you is that seeing as the Reform Act didn't have the desired impact, do you see anything on the horizon, or do you have any suggestions for those that are still involved in party politics as to where do we go from here, since that didn't achieve what it was meant to?
Thanks. And these just very quickly.
Well, actually, my question is along the same lines, but rather than looking forward, mine is more looking back. Why didn't MPs empower themselves to take more control? When the bill was presented, and even after it was passed, there, I believe, caucuses still have to have votes in order to be able to institute some of the provisions, which I think, generally speaking, they don't, and they just continue to leave power within the leadership. Why aren't MPs empowering themselves?
Thank you.
For me, this is just for Robert, that I find that the real big problem is this pipeline that wants to go through the Sudetenland territory. And I feel that the Prime Minister should stop hemming and hawing and just not do it. Get rid of the pipeline. We should be going towards renewable energies. And I know he's in the pockets of the big oil corporations, but I feel that...
Do you have a question?
Yeah, that's basically it. What do you feel? How can we move it forward so that we stop relying on fossil fuels and go towards renewable energies?
Okay, thank you.
I guess I'm the closer. So we talked a little bit about social media, and we talked a little bit about encouraging people from different backgrounds to run, including women. And so my question to both of you is sort of in this era where for women with any profile, and especially profile in politics, they receive so many death threats and threats of sexual violence every day on social media, and we start to see that bleeding into real life, as we've seen with Minister McKenna. When young women are thinking about that in their calculation about whether they should go into politics or get involved, what guidance do you have to offer?
Thanks. Okay.
I'm just going to answer that question. Because, social media is here to stay, and women or racialized candidates or anyone who's a bit different, probably Indigenous candidates, the same thing. For anybody who seems different from the norm probably faces a disproportionate amount of negative social media. And I don't take it lightly. I remember when Jo, what was her last name? The Labour MP was, pardon me? Yeah, she was murdered during the election campaign in Britain, the Labour MP. So I don't take that stuff lightly. I think there is a continuum. And it's, as soon as you lift your head up above the parapet and say, I want to have a voice, you get that. And the higher you go, I think the worse it gets. We had a couple of former women premiers at Ryerson a few weeks back, and I mean, they talked about some of the vitriol that they faced. And one of them said, which was what I did, was just block anybody who was negative or violent, or, well, if it's threatening, you go to the police. But if it's just sexist garbage, I would just block it, or my staff would block it. There was one former PM who said at a certain period of time, her staff changed all the passwords for her social media and wouldn't let her look at it because there was so much negativity. That's all. I always feel if people don't have the guts to put their name to something, it's probably not worth listening to. So I tended not to pay enough attention to it. But I think you just, you have to blaze through that. You just have to say, the most important thing I can do to counter that kind of crap is in fact to raise my voice and to run for office. So I would encourage young women to do that.
Well, I think the thing about it's interesting, Michael Chong's bill, that it includes it's an optional issues or optional decisions that, the parliamentarians can make this choice. But there is, I think, for instance, in 2015, I think there were a lot of, not IOUs, but this feeling, we're here in government, why were a lot of us elected? You have to look at people's polling numbers before, and I think I had pretty good polling numbers. I'm not sure I owed all my victory to Mr. Trudeau, because I had just run for mayor, previous to that, that federal election. And so I already had quite a large following in my own area. And so I thought it was quite a reasonable idea to run and have a potential of winning, not the sacrificial lamb. But I think a lot of other MPs felt that there is a lot owing to your leader. And, you want to curry, I think some do want to curry favor. They want to see promotions. They'd like to be in cabinet. It's everyone's dream, apparently, to be in cabinet. Everyone's dream to be if they're not in cabinet, a parliamentary secretary, a chair of a committee, and so on down the food chain until you're sitting on the Library of Parliament committee, which I have sat on the Library of Parliament committee. It's a lovely committee. They do a fine sandwich lunch once in a while with the senators, and you get to listen to Mike Duffy speak for an hour and a half. Sorry, Mike, if you're listening there. It's not a criticism. You actually do have a very smooth talker. But there's something there in the human nature, and I think it shouldn't have been probably a vote. It should have been automatic. These are the rules by which the political parties or the caucus will be governed. Because I think when the crisis arises and you need to remove your leader, or the political party has an issue going on which is so strong that calls into confidence the leader himself or herself, that it should almost be like we can instigate, this. But that would lead to chaos that we have in Australia or sometimes in England. Boris, Johnson seems to be doing okay today, but he came due to the chaos that Theresa May was living with. I don't know, it's very difficult. People have to make the decision. Are they going to be thinking that they're going to be there in 30 years as an MP? Or are you likely going to be only there for 1 or 2 terms, maximum 3 terms? Most MPs are turfed after a certain number of terms. There's very, very few safe seats, except for in a few places in the prairies today. NDP seats and Liberal seats seem to change sides quite often. And so that's the difficult. And then the Wet'suwet'en, I will say about one of the things I think this whole issue surrounding reconciliation, Indigenous peoples, Wet'suwet'en, solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en, this is actually a proxy war for many different groups, whether you're environmentalists or corporate interests or people who want jobs, Indigenous peoples, you have hereditary chiefs, you have traditionalists, you have elected band councils, you have people just who want simple jobs, they're all coming at it from a different perspective and using this in their own fashion to try and get what it is that they want in society. For me, as an Indigenous leader, the first thing I say is, what do the Wet'suwet'en people themselves want? How do they wish to be governed? Who do they want their lawful jurisdiction to be? Who owns that or controls that jurisdiction? And how is it answerable through a system of accountability? And that's for them to decide. And right now, I think there's lots of people getting involved. There's lots of questions surrounding legitimacy of hereditary chiefs, of elected chiefs, and I think the Wet'suwet'en need to sit down, figure that out, and then, the Canada can sit down with them and say, okay, or, companies, corporations, British Columbia government in this case, say, okay, this is what we want to do. What's the benefit, cost-benefit analysis? What's the benefit to the community? And is this really the long-term interest? And I know people have different ideas around it, but I don't think we should, as Canadians, be imposing, going out and protesting in the streets for Wet'suwet'en solidarity. Because solidarity for who? And that is a huge one for me. If Indigenous peoples want to build a pipeline, okay. But that should be their decision that they make on their own without, 50,000 other different groups or interest groups making that decision or trying to make that decision for them.
Great. On reform. I learn so much when you're always here, Robert. I do. I miss sitting on committee with you, but not that much. I'm not running again. So
we can form a fake committee. We can just sit together. We could pretend.
We'll play Parliament. Yeah. On the reform issue, I will tell you that the Conservative caucus did adhere and follow the rules that were set out in that piece of legislation. And we did take the votes that we needed to take. And Robert's exactly correct. The reason why the votes don't always go in favor of giving the power to the MPs to remove the leader is because they're afraid of the leader. Because you just got elected and you may have just won and you're told that you won or you did better because of your leader. So that's what goes through the minds of many. We did, though, take the step within the Conservative caucus to take the power back of appointing our own caucus chair, which is no longer a position that is doled out from the leadership. It is one which people campaign for, and they are then, as a result, beholden to the people who elect them as opposed to beholden to the Prime Minister's office, which is really important, or the Leader's office, which is really important when you're dealing with caucus matters. So we got there a little bit. Michael's probably not happy with how it all unfolded, but it was a great try, and it doesn't mean that it's over. And he is a great example of a member of Parliament who understood the enormity and the importance of the role of parliamentary structures when he came into office, and just continues to build on it. And he's going to make us all a better parliamentarian by the end of the day. And luckily, he's in a riding where he will get elected over and over again, because we're better for having him there. And guidance to women. Okay, so here it is in a nutshell, and I'm not going to go long on it. Number 1, block, for sure. Number 2, report. And number 3, protect yourself. That's basically it. And do not let it deter you from running for office, period. Kath McKenna is not the first cabinet minister to be put under close protection, and she will not be the last one. Michelle Rempel had close protection. I had RCMP protection. Jim Prentice had RCMP protection. Jim Flaherty had RCMP. Tony Clement had RCMP protection. It happens. It is part of the job, unfortunately. What's interesting about social media is that it's just getting a lot more notoriety and being told a little bit more. What I was not impressed with on the Kath McKenna piece, though, is the vandalism that happened at her office. That was a step too far, but that's where you report, and that's why we all have these Ring doorbells now that will tell you who has been on your porch or who's been around, and they can identify the person, and then they need to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, because we're not going to put up with that in our democracy. But as I said, do not let yourself be stopped as a result. So when the leadership came around this time, and I realized that we were going into another leadership race, my question to myself of whether or not I was going to throw my hat in the ring wasn't about whether or not I felt I was going to be hassled more or harassed more. That didn't come across my mind whatsoever, and it shouldn't come across your mind either. There are protections in place for public figures, and you can protect yourself and your family easily by making sure that you don't allow them to get to you through social media. And if you do have a threat, you take it seriously and you report it up. And you're right, Peggy. I mean, I didn't like it when there was another, a female a congresswoman who got shot many, many years ago, 10 years ago in the United States. And I thought about her as well, too. Yeah. And, you know, these things unfortunately do happen, and people do take matters into their own hands. But for goodness sake, don't let it stop you or even make you pause, because there's going to be people out there who want to do hateful things based upon nothing.
So I'm going to call Kendall Anderson, the Executive Director of Samara, to bring us to a close.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kendall Anderson. Thank you all so much for coming. I know that this is a tough time for everyone as we face these questions around COVID-19. And so I really appreciate you being here, and I hope you'll remain safe. Please feel free to stay after and chat about some of the things that we've heard from the panelists today. There are books for sale in the lobby. And I want to say thank you to the Samara staff, Jose, Liz, Yvonne, and especially to Mike for hosting the panel today. And especially I want to say thank you so much to our panelists, not only for being here today, but also for your public service. It's so important that people put themselves up for this job, and we know it's a sacrifice. And I know sometimes Samara seems like we're not on the side of the MPs, but we absolutely are. And we want everyone to feel that they have the right and the responsibility to run for office or be part of politics. So thank you so much. Let's have another round of applause.